Hello and welcome to Meanbrews. I'm Matthew Harold. Sorry for the lack of videos the past couple of months. We've been in the throes of our annual homebrewing competition, Operation Fermentation, coordinating the judging and the entries and the sort and all those types of things. Just got through with judging. It was quite an impressive fleet of beers that we judged. So now I'm getting back into the routine of making these videos. And today we're covering English Strong Bitter, or ESB. So let's get right into the data and go through it. I've got 21 winning Strong Bitter recipes, 12 of which were gold, 3 silver, 4 bronze, and 2 award-winning. Quite unique that we don't have any best of show winners for this style. I guess it just doesn't show up very well on the table in these competitions. The BJCP style is 11C. An average strength to moderately strong British bitter ale. The balance may be fairly even between malt and hops to somewhat bitter. Drinkability is a critical component of the style. When you're looking at how the style is evolving over time, surprisingly there's a bit of evolution here. We'll go through that, and it's in many different places. And the variation is very minimal between recipes. Everything's evolving at the same time, so there's no real uniqueness, I would say, between recipes, or not a lot of uniqueness between recipes. For the original gravity, the BJCP range is 1.048 to 1.060. The mean of 1.054 is right on the BJCP average. We had a few stragglers over here. These are probably best bitters that people entered as strong bitters or regular bitters. That would be my guess here. We are seeing an increase in OG over time, about 0.1 point per year is when I plotted this. So a little bit of a change to go up in gravity and strength. For the IBUs, again, the range is 30 to 50 IBUs with an average of 38, a little bit under the average for BJCP. We also have a few stragglers here on the lower end outside of the range. I would stick somewhere in the middle here for your beer. Color range is quite tight, between 12 and 15, I believe, 16. So, not a lot of variation here on color. The range of the style is much greater than the examples that I saw online. The average was 13.5. For the malt percentages, we had an average of 82.1% of base malt, mostly Maris Otter, wheat, and Munich. We'll get into that in a second. Next most prominent was crystal malt at 8.8%. Then we had toasted malts, 6.5%. A little bit of adjunct, 2.2% adjunct on average, and a tiny bit of roast, probably just for color, 0.4% roast malts. When you look at the base malts, we had 4 base malts used. Maris Otter and Golden Promise were the most prominent. We had 90% of the recipes used Maris Otter, Golden Promise, and an average of around 79-80% of the grist. Pretty tight range here as well. Next most prominent was Optic Malt. I never actually used this. 10% of the recipes used Optic Malt and an average of 90% of the grist. And next was Munich Malt. 10% of the recipes used Munich, and an average of about 13% of the grist. We also had one recipe that used wheat malt. Most people use flaked wheat instead of wheat malt for their recipes. Crystal malts, quite a few, 5 different crystal malts were used. The most prominent was light crystal. Big range here from about 3.5 to 17.5%. The average was 7.7% of the grist. Next most prominent was medium crystal. Pretty good range there as well. I think 52% of the recipes used medium crystal at an average rate of about 6% of the grist. Then we have dark crystal. 38% of the recipes used dark crystal, an average of 3% of the grist. And I think that's it. Carapils and Special B round those out, but they're so low in the likelihood of being used that I did not include in this data set. Toasted malts, the most prominent toasted malt was Biscuit. And if you know, Biscuit, melanoidin, and aromatic are all very similar. So the blue, red, and orange curves here all kind of line up with using about 5% of Biscuit or melanoidin or aromatic malts. Biscuit is the English, actually Belgian and English style of that type of malt, which is the one I would use for this style. 5% of the grist was the average. 30% of the recipes use biscuit. But if you include these others, you probably would say 50% use the same type of specialty malt here, toasted specialty malt. Next most prominent was the actual toasted base malt. 14% of the recipes used the toasted base malt at an average of about 20% of the grist. If you do use a toasted base malt, I've heard that I've used it once in a beer. You should definitely let it rest for at least a couple weeks after you toast it. There's a lot of guidance online on how to toast base malt. But when you don't let it rest, and I have examples of this with my beers, you do get a harsh flavor that comes through in the beer. So letting it rest for a little bit after you toast the malt will drive off those volatile, harsh notes that sometimes can come up in these toasted operations. Next most prominent was an amber malt. 20% of the recipes used an amber malt at an average of 5% of the grist. We had one recipe use a special roast, but I wouldn't recommend using special roast it's just not commonly used here. Roasted malts, we had 3 roasted malts. Most prominent is chocolate. 14% of the recipes used a chocolate malt. Really tight curve there at 1.2% of the grist. We're all under 5%, so these are just color modifiers. Maybe a little brown malt to get a little bit of coffee or bready notes. I get a lot of that with brown malt, but mostly just color modifiers here. I'm not going to recommend a roast malt to be put in your beer unless you want to modify the color. Adjuncts. Most common adjunct is flaked wheat. Like I said before, 7.5% of the grist use 14% of the recipes used a flaked wheat. The next most common is flaked barley. 10% of the recipes use flaked barley at an average of 7.3% of the grist. And then flaked corn or brown sugar round out those. A single recipe each used those adjuncts. So let's look at how our malts are evolving. I think when I learned how to brew beer, the guidance I was given was a bitter should be base malt and crystal malts. We're seeing that change a little bit. The blue curve is crystal, and we're seeing the crystal malt likelihood of use go down just a bit from about 10% to 8% through the years. And yet we're seeing an increase in toasted and roasted malts used in this style. I think we'll take this guidance and use it in our recipe formulation later on in this video. But it's interesting to note that people are using less crystal malts and more toasted, roasted flavors in this style. Bittering hops are all over the place. Goldings, of course, the English Kent Goldings, not Styrian Goldings, is most prominently used, but I don't think it really matters. I really like Chinook in English styles as a bittering hop. It brings a unique bittering to the table there. But again, you can use pretty much anything. There's German, American, and British hops in this list. Flavor hops, this is where you're getting into the regional styles. East Kent Goldings and Fuggles dominated here, and I would recommend either one or the other. Aroma hops, Fuggles and Goldings again, dominant. Tettnang showed up here, 15%, pretty interesting. Again, I would stick with your English varieties, Fuggles or East Kent Goldings. One thing to note is that I didn't plot it here, but Fuggles is trending down on usage over time, and Goldings is trending up. So I would defer to Goldings now in this day and age versus early 2000s. Whirlpool hops, not a lot of recipes use Whirlpool hops. I'll show that in a later slide, but if they did, it was either East Kent or Styrian Goldings. Again, not a lot of recipes use dry hops, and it was equally mixed between a bunch of different dry hops here. 2 British and 2 American hop varieties. Rate of hop additions, aroma hops were used in about 85% of the recipes here. So I definitely recommend aroma hops right at around 0.2 ounce per gallon. That's about an ounce in a 5-gallon batch. The next most prominent, flavor hops. Again, 75% of the recipes use flavor hops at 0.15 ounces per gallon. I think that's, 3/4 3/4 ounce in a late hop edition. Dry hops and whirlpool hops were just not used in this style very much for the recipes that I've investigated, so I'm not going to use those here. The rates were right on par with the other two, but just not prominently used. Late hop edition evolution, we're seeing a slight increase. This is about, let's say, 0.12 to 0.18 maybe on the curve, so about a 50% increase for, which one is this, flavor hops. And for aroma hops, a little bit less of an increase, even though the slope's the same, it's starting out higher. But they're both gradually trending to a higher rate than what the average is. Mash type, it had 0 decoction mashes, of course. I was kind of surprised. 82% single infusion mashes. Surprised to see 18% or even any step mashes here for this style. But yes, there were about 1 in 5 were step mashed. And there were different rests that they utilized. Here are the rests, and there was one recipe that had a glucan rest at 102. It says 104, but it was 102. There's a protein rest, 2 protein rests with an average of 134, 1 beta rest at 140, and the times are here on this chart as well if you want to see that. I wouldn't use any of these. Saccharification rest, the main alpha acid rest was 153 for 62 minutes. That's the only, I would do a step mash for the style. Not a step mash, but an infusion mash for the style. 153 for around an hour. Alpha rest, we're seeing a big decrease from about 156.5 down to 150, 151. Trying to make a more fermentable wort. This in combination with fewer crystal malts and more toasted malts, it's pretty interesting. People are looking for a more drinkable beer, more fermentable wort. Kind of surprising here. So you'll see me hit it at 153 for my rest temperatures in my recipe at the end. Boil duration anywhere from 60 minutes to 90 minutes. Excuse me. 70 minutes was the mean. As far as the yeast used, the most prominent is 1968 White Lab 002. This is the fuller strain. This is the classic strain for the style. Some others use, but I'm not going to deviate from this style. You can pause this slide if you want to see what else was used. Mostly British, some American strains, some Irish strains. Some I couldn't identify where the source was, but mostly, if not all, British, American, or Irish strains. Fermentation temperature was an average of 67 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees C. And the average was right there. We did see a range between 64 and 70. We are again seeing a decrease in fermentation temperature over time. I guess people are going for fewer esters. You're going to see me in my recipe start here and let free rise. I do like the ester profile in these styles to balance out the maltiness and the bitterness in the style, so you'll see that reflected in my recipe. Other variables, the average carbonation volume was about 1.73 volumes of CO2. I don't think anyone went over 2 for this style. It should be low carbonated to be comparable with the styles you get in England. All right, so on to my recipe. I'm going to use 82% Maris Otter base malt. You can sub that with Golden Promise if that's your preferred. I personally like Maris Otter better. I'm going to put in about 6.5% English biscuit, and then I'm going to put 4.5% light crystal, crystal 40, 3.5% crystal 60, 2.5% flaked wheat, excuse me, and 1% crystal 120. If you can get the double roasted crystal, it's wonderful, wonderful crystal malt. If not, just look for the darkest crystal malt you can get. It's going to add a lot of complexity, even at 1%. I'm going to add about 35 IBUs of EKG at 60 minutes. I'm going to add 0.15 ounce per gallon of EKG at 15 minutes and 0.2 ounce per gallon of EKG at flame out. And I'm going to stick with the White Lab 002. My original gravity I'm shooting for is 1.054 at 38 IBUs. Not a lot of info on water chemistry. I think these are typically heavy mineralized waters used in the region here. So I'm going to have a minimum of 100 ppm sulfate. Burton water, unboiled, is around 600 ppm of sulfate, and you could go much higher on sulfate for this style. Shoot for around 50 to 100 ppm of chlorides. Mash at 5.5 pH. Use your favorite mash acid. Sparge and boil for 60 minutes. Chill to 65F. Oxygenate and pitch. You want to pitch not very big. Consider using vitality starter. If you don't know what a vitality starter is, it's pitching a starter that's in the throes of fermenting in the starter. You just want to make sure the yeast is healthy, that it's eating, that it's alive. You don't want to overpitch the style. You want to generate those esters. Ferment at 67, and if you want more esters, which I do, let it free rise to the low 70s, around 71, 72, somewhere in that range, and keep it there to the remainder of its fermentation. Cold crash, keg or bottle at 1.7 volumes of CO2. I didn't put the, just noticed I didn't put the mash temperature. I'm going to do an infusion mash. Let's go back. I'm going to do an infusion mash at 153. I'm going to stay at the mean here on this style. So that's it for this episode, and appreciate your patience and waiting for this video. I know it's been a long time. I hope you got some value out of this one. I will put another poll up to see what styles you'd like for me to do next, and appreciate you watching this episode. And please subscribe and hit the notification bell on the corner there. I appreciate it. Thanks, and see you in a couple weeks. Bye-bye.